Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm Sarah, or as you may also know me, the Fluffy Curvy Princess. And today we're going to be talking about the 6 cult memoirs I read, all of which to some extent will be focusing on the Church of the Firstborn of the Fulness of Time. In the past, this channel covered the FLDS, or Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Those who have any knowledge on the history of the LDS, or better known Mormon Church, will know that over time there has been certain changes in policies, such as how many wives you can have. And as with most religions throughout history, certain disagreements have caused church splits. Several of the groups that left the mainline Mormon Church have created very strict fundamentalist versions of Mormonism, most, if not all, of which would be considered cults and are condemned by the mainline Mormon Church. One of these strangest groups that I like to talk about, which is not as popular as the FLDS, is the Church of the Firstborn of the Fulness of Time. Today I want to talk about not only them, but their long, deadly rivalry with the Church of the Lamb of God, as told over 6 memoirs. Let's start with an inside image from the cult's earliest days, under its official prophet in the book, Shattered Dreams by Irene Spencer. Irene Spencer was born as the 4th child of the 2nd wife of a man named Morris Q. Kunz on February 1st, 1937. She was the 13th child in the family, and she was literally there for the creation of the FLDS, the official beginnings of the Church of the Firstborn. Her uncle was also considered the first official prophet of the Apostolic Brethren, which is one of, if not the first fundamentalist Mormon group. So yeah, she was there back in the old ages of traditional fundamental Mormonism. 4 of her sisters joined the FLDS with their husbands when it started, and she considered joining for a while. Her memoir covers a lot of things that none of the other memoirs I've read have covered. She personally witnessed things that only other people in other memoirs I've read have heard about. For example, she lived and saw the Short Creek raid happening and saw the police cars driving up to the FLDS compound, which some of you may have heard of in my other video, which was when a bunch of police officers went to arrest men for practicing polygamy in secret. These men and women mentioned hearing about it growing up with their memoirs, but Irene got to see it with her own eyes to an extent. Now, as for her personal life, she had an illegal marriage to Ervil LeBaron on July 3rd, 1953 at the age of 16. Ervil LeBaron was the youngest brother of the supposed prophet Joel LeBaron, whose father started the Church of the Firstborn, though I believe Joel was the first official prophet. Ervil at the time was the 3rd most important leader of the cult, though he would become the most important over time. She was his 2nd wife, and awkwardly, his 1st wife was her fool sister. And yes, she very clearly points out how weird it was in the book. Her older sister does her best to be graceful, but obviously there's still a lot of tension. And funny enough, if you study the Bible in the Old Testament, which is what some of the fundamentalist Mormons use to justify polygamy, God really specifically said that men, if they were going to practice polygamy, could not marry sisters because it just was not fair to the sisters to do that to them. Not that the Bible modern day supports polygamy, but I'm just saying, even in the context of assuming that it did, because the Old Testament allowed it, what they were doing still would not have been allowed. She gave birth to 13 children while in the Church of the Firstborn, as well as adopted one. She got to be there for the origins of the cult, as Joel became the first official prophet. Irene talks about laboring in the hot sun with little amenities, living in little more than 3 or 4 room shacks with multiple other wives and their children. She leaves and re-enters the cult a few times, but permanently leaves after Verlin dies. It is a strange affair, as the night before he dies, he tells her about having a dream and knowing that his time has come. She begs him not to go on the road trip he's planning, but he does anyway, stoically just saying that when it's your time, it's your time. After this, she permanently leaves the group and finds peace in Protestant Christianity. She has written 2 other books that I have not read that I believe talk about the rival cult, Church of the Lamb of God. And she said in this book she specifically didn't talk about their leader Ervil, who was also her brother-in-law and brother of the supposed prophet Joel, because she wanted this to focus on her life and not on the drama of her family. I do think this was a good book and I would recommend it. It is long, but it offers really interesting history about the beginnings of fundamental Mormonism that other books just don't have because their writers weren't as old. Next up, we have Daughters of Zion by Kim Taylor. Kim Taylor was born in 1955 and was the youngest daughter of Leo Warner and his only wife, Tessa. Her family was originally part of the mainstream LDS Church, but they joined in 1960 after reading some literature written by Ervil LeBaron. When Leo went to talk to the mainline Mormon Church and asked them some questions, they weren't really thrilled with what he had to say and they kicked him and his family out. So they decided to join Joel's church. While she grew up in the cult, she ends up becoming friends with some of the people who write memoirs later, one girl being named Susan. Susan would actually end up also marrying Ervil LeBaron. She was also sister to Kathy, who would end up marrying the prophet Joel LeBaron. Kim dated the previously mentioned Ervil LeBaron and Ervil and Joel, who, again, all 3 of these men were middle-aged men at the time, expressed an interest in her romantically while she was a teenager. And again, as I said, grown middle-aged men. She does become close and kind of dates this man named Mark Chenoweth, who's her own age, but unfortunately goes sour as there is a church split where Ervil LeBaron ends up leaving the church to start the Church of the Lamb of God, and Mark joins him. And I feel like this is the time when I can talk about the church split and the rivalry that starts. Ervil, as previously mentioned, is the brother of Joel LeBaron, started his own church as he and Joel were having a lot of disagreements. Ervil eventually decides that he is the only true leader of the Mormon church, and all these other false Mormon teachers need to be put to death. And so Ervil sends his cult members out to do this. Kathy, again sister of Kim, was in the same city as Joel when he died, though thankfully she didn't have to witness it. One of the many children of Joel did have to witness it, as he was hiding in a car when the murder happened. While Mark did not murder Joel, he did know it was going to happen and got involved in several other violent activities and murders, which obviously hurt Kim a lot. She felt like she no longer knew him. The book also mentions how Ervil would send his people with weapons to attack the colonies that the Church of the Firstborn lived in. I think something also important to note that was in this memoir is that while most of these memoirs talk about the supposed prophet Joel in glowing terms, perhaps from the nostalgia and because he was murdered so brutally, Kathy highlights him in a more negative light. She mentions how her sister was once slapped by Joel because she was asking too many questions about his supposed vision of seeing God and the prophets. He also used to hold one of his children upside down by the leg and spank him that way. So while the others tend to talk about only positively, I think in some ways she's a little more realistic. Well, I could be wrong because her sister was married to him and knew him. Like most of the husbands in these books where people practicing polygamy, her sister lived in pretty much poverty because he couldn't afford to take care of them. She mentions that 2 of Kathy's children were mentally ill and that the church did not give them the care or pity that they should have. Kim eventually leaves the cult and gets married as a young adult. She has 5 children with her new husband. Verlon is very upset by this and tried to convince her not to do it, but she ignores him. She is now a mainline Christian, though for a time she was involved in a cult that her sister Carolyn and her husband have been running. Kim and her husband, though, eventually leave that cult, join a Christian church, and become the guardians of Kathy's children after Kathy passes away. She briefly mentions how the children had to flee Mexico, and we will find later that one of those children wrote her own memoir. Next up, we have Favorite Wife by Susan Ray Schmidt. We mentioned Susan in the previous memoir as being a brief friend of Kim. Susan was born in 1953 to a family that also was not in the Church of the Firstborn. Susan's family joined the church when she was 6 years old. Though she had 9 siblings, only 5 of them went down to Mexico to join the church. In this book, it's made very clear what the different brothers' positions are. Joel, who was not the oldest brother, was made the prophet. Ervil was the second command and called the church patriarch, and he did a lot of the missionary work, while Verlon was considered the president of the 12 apostles and the third most important in the church. It also clarifies how Ervil started to get some weird ideas and the slippery slope from him being a respected church member to a cult leader. He taught that it was okay to steal from non-Mormons as long as it was done in the name of the church, something that Joel and the other brothers disagreed with. He believed that people should be put to death for breaking the 10 Commandments, something that Joel did not believe should be instituted now, or perhaps ever. He also believed in blood atonement, which he carried out on people in different fundamentalist Mormon groups. Blood atonement is the idea that a person commits a sin so bad that they need to be murdered to be forgiven, and was one of the reasons why he had people in these other cults murdered. The FLDS under Warren Jeffs was also going that way. He also began to have supposed revelations about people and their future to try to manipulate them. When Susan was only 14 years old, Ervil went up to her and said God had given him a special revelation, saying that she was supposed to marry him secretly. Thankfully, she knew he was talking garbage and was like, no thanks, I'm not going to do that. She did end up marrying Verlon, though, like literally a few days after she turned 15, which also is illegal and kind of weird. But she did say in her memoir that she believes she ended up in a much better place with Verlon than if she had married Ervil, who ended up starting that violent cult. Again, not at all an excuse or making it okay for Verlon to have done what he did to her. When he was courting Kim, he was a middle-aged man by this point. She ended up having 5 children with him and 1 child afterward. And okay, if you're wondering at all if maybe he didn't know what he was doing was wrong, I will tell you that in the book, Susan mentions how she points out she would love to spend more time with Verlon and travel with him. But he says that they can't, because if they do, the police might catch him and send him to prison for being married to an underage girl, which in my mind shows that he knew he was doing wrong and committing a crime, to some extent. As Susan's married to the same person as Irene, she gets to talk about similar events from a different perspective, which I always love in these books. In Shattered Dreams, Irene talks about being constantly depressed and feeling hopeless and negative, and how living in the cult was extremely hard, living in near poverty. But Susan said that Irene was always very accepting on the outside and cheerful, as opposed to some of the other wives. Susan mentions how some of the wives were cruel, cold, and accusatory towards her, while Irene was always kind and generous. Now, Irene talks positively about Susan as well in her book. I just find it interesting how Irene talked so much about being miserable, while Susan points out how Irene never let on how miserable she was. I also found it interesting how sometimes the things Verlin would say to Susan to be romantic were similar things he would say to Irene. And it's just kind of icky to think that two women are married to the same man and he tells them the same things to romance them. As for being the favorite wife, as the title suggests, Susan was told this by some of his other wives that she's the favorite wife, as Verlin would tend to do things for her he wouldn't do for other wives. This sometimes made Susan uncomfortable though, because then the other wives would take it out on her. Be like, why are you getting special treatment? Special treatment which she pointed out she very rarely asked for. As for the timeline of what's going on in the cult, Ervil is arrested for the murder of Joel, but released almost immediately after what is believed to be bribes. Several other people are murdered and go missing permanently, which is a very scary event for everybody involved. Eventually, though, one of Susan's cousins named Rena, who is the sister of Mark Chenoweth mentioned in Kim's memoir, anyway, she murders Rulon, Irene's uncle, the supposed prophet of the Apostolic Brethren. After all this goes down, Ervil goes to jail permanently until his death, which happened shortly after. Because she's a cousin of the Mark Chenoweth mentioned by Kim, you'll find out a lot about him and his sister's lives before they ended up joining Ervil's more violent cult. Eventually, though, Susan is done with this lifestyle. She's done living in poverty and being treated as just one of the many wives of this man. She has her father drive her to one of the brothers' homes that never ended up joining that cult. Her father is unaware of what's going on until he drops them off. This happens on November 25th in 1976. Verlin tries several means to get her to return, including offering to divorce Charlotte, threatening to take away her children, as well as offering to help her out when she has a child out of wedlock with another man. Susan stays strong throughout the zone. Eventually, Susan is officially kicked out in a small cult court hearing accusing her of adultery, which she's fine with. She's like, I'm done with you people. Just like Irene, Susan converts to mainline Christianity and actually mentions that a lot of the people who ended up leaving the Church of the Firstborn also converted to mainline Protestant Christianity, and that a lot of them have found peace in it, which I think is wonderful. She eventually marries a man named Demis Ray who treats her well. And throughout this book, especially near the end, she has a lot of spiritual reflection and talks about how she personally studied the Bible and the Book of Mormon and was able to see how the church wasn't true and how it motivated her to leave and confront Verlin. Next up, we have The Sound of Gravel by Ruth Warner. Ruth Warner is the niece of Kim Taylor, who wrote Daughters of Zion, and she is the daughter of Kathy and Joel. She was born in May of 1972 and the 39th child of her father, fourth to her mother. Now, I mentioned earlier that Kim's book talked about how some of Kathy's children were mentally ill, but this book makes it clear just how mentally ill Audrey was. She was still wetting the bed at 10 years old, was not allowed to go to school because she was so violent, and would swallow gum whole. She at times would make strange noises and would rock herself and could be extremely violent. She mentioned that her brother Luke, who was also mentally ill, was much more docile and was allowed to go to school, though he was a little developmentally delayed. While Luke would live with Kim for a while, as mentioned in Kim's book, and become somewhat independent, Audrey would have to eventually put away in a home because she would become extremely violent and try to hurt her family. It's very sad to read about because it's so obvious that the church does not care at all about providing proper care, and her stepfather treats her very roughly because in his mind there's no other way to try to get her to obey. This book also confirmed that schizophrenia ran in the LeBaron family, which is something that I suspected from reading the other memoirs, because the other memoirs did mention that the people in the LeBaron family had mental illness or had made great claims about how God was calling them for these special things. And while these things are in line with schizophrenia, I obviously am not qualified to make a diagnosis, but this book confirmed that certain people in her family, including two of her uncles at least, did have it. Now, Ruth doesn't ever know her father Joel because he's murdered around the time of her birth. And unfortunately, her mother remarries a man, and this stepfather is extremely abusive. This book is very, very graphic. She and her stepsisters are repeatedly and abused. While they went to their mothers multiple times telling them what happened, very little consequence actually came about it until the events became public. When this happened, he was kicked out of the community, supposed to be for 2 years, but was only kicked out for a few months because they had decided he had suffered enough humiliation. Ruth offered some really heartbreaking statements about the situation and about how her mother talked about it. After her mother had confronted her stepfather about the abuse, she had told Ruth, He was crying, Ruthie. I wondered how it didn't occur to Mom that I'd cried too, countless times over the years. Tears of pain, tears of anger, tears of shame. But that morning I couldn't cry. And later, she says, she shed many tears that day, but I don't think a single one of them was for me. It's just so painful, I guess, in my mind, how a mother would rather pick the support of a guy than protect her own children, which is a common theme, unfortunately, that I've seen both in books and in real life. And I just don't understand how anyone could do that, because your child is someone that you created, and he's just a man. And I think few books have ever shown the pain that children go through when their mothers pick men over their own children than this one. Eventually, Kathy meets an untimely death, and 2 of her brothers die, and it is recounted in graphic detail as they are playing outside one day, and her father, who did not know how to wire electricity, had wired some electricity by a fence. The children touched it and died, and then when the mother went out to find them, her glasses came off and she fell and also passed away. It's really, really horrible to read about, but I think it is necessary. These details are very briefly glossed over in Kim's book. While as this is Ruth's story and she was there to physically see this, she goes into the details, and it is a painful thing to read. Unlike some of these other books, this book was about Ruth's own journey and family, much more than it was about the cult. And I totally respect that and think that's valid. It reminded me a lot of Unspeakable by Jessica Willis Fisher, because she also grew up in a very toxic religious background. And while that is talked about a lot and dissected to an extent, she also talks a lot about just the bad family life and the horrible leadership that went on there. Out of all of the memoirs I'm going to mention today, though, I think this one, The Sound of Gravel by Ruth Warner, is the one I would recommend the most. It is the most universal, I think, of all of these, and talks a lot about just genuine human pain and resilience. Eventually, Ruth is able to move on and get married and have a happy life after all of this. And at the time, she says that she's not really religious. Next up, we have The Polygamist Daughter by Ervil LeBaron. Now, this one is a doozy because Ervil LeBaron is the daughter of Anna May and the infamous Ervil LeBaron. Her parents joined the Church of the Firstborn while Ervil was still a legit member and leader. And then he decided to steal Anna May from her husband, saying that he had a divine revelation that she needed to divorce her husband and marry him instead. And then Anna was born from this union. Anna only met Ervil, her biological father, 3 times. She remembers her father writing a lot, and she did go on one mission event with him. But other than that, she has basically no memories of him because she never saw him. He was always in hiding from the FBI because he was a criminal. Eventually, her mom and siblings would hide out in America and would be providing slave labor for her dad's second-in-command, Dan Jordan. They would also live in poverty, though not as bad as a lot of the families down in Mexico. They would frequently, though, raid trash bins for food, as well as go into those donation bins to try to steal clothing to wear. She remembers being shipped between Mexico and America a lot as a little girl, and every once in a while the FBI would raid their home and arrest people while they were there. So it was definitely a terrifying time for her. She would leave the cult at 13 years old, which is younger than I think anyone else on this list. She would run away from home to live with her half-sister Lillian and her husband, Mark Chenoweth. Yep, the Mark Chenoweth. So we talked about Mark Chenoweth being involved with the Church of the Lamb of God and getting involved in violence. And the good news was that eventually he and his wife Lillian would see that Ervil was full of crap, and they would flee the cult and be genuinely sorry for the things they did. Whether they should be let off the hook for that or not is not for me to judge, but all I will say is I'm happy they realized that they were in a lie and left it. And combined with Kim's memoir, it's really interesting because Kim talks about the younger years while Anna talks about what was like as they were older and left the cult. They ended up joining an Assembly of God church that unfortunately was involved with Bill Gothard, who is culty, though I will say he is nothing compared to the stuff like the Church Lamb of God, alright? So they were able to find some peace in the Assembly of God church, and I think that is good. Like, again, Bill Gothard is not great, but between him and a cult that literally kills people, I think we can see there's clearly one's better than the other. She did leave a literal cult for Christianity, so I do think that's a good thing, even if some of the stuff in her church might not have been the best. Sadly, several important people in her life are murdered, including Mark Chenoweth, his brother Dwayne, and Dwayne's daughter Jenny, all on the same day as a consequence for leaving. Lillian shortly afterwards takes her own life. Anna recounts the terror that followed and how the police had to literally be outside their home and set up watch lights and stuff to make sure they were safe. And they had to follow them and set up really intense security for the funerals to make sure no one was hurt. It's a very painful time for her. As mentioned earlier, her father died shortly after his arrest. She would end up visiting his grave 3 times, which she said felt interesting as that was the amount of time she saw him in real life. And whenever she would visit his grave, there would be a sort of anger at the words written on the tomb, which would talk about how he was a great dad and loved, which she felt resentful about because her dad wasn't even there. She, to an extent, has some sympathy for him, saying that he was not in his right mind. Mental illness runs in our family. And given, as Ruth Warner mentioned, schizophrenia runs in the family, she may be very right. If people are undiagnosed and not taking proper medication, people can believe things that are just not true and be convinced that there's something they're not. Anna went through a lot of depression after all this, understandably, but at this point is married and says she is in a good place. She is a committed Christian and says that through therapy she has been able to make peace with things and to look at God as the father figure that she never had. One quote that I found inspiring was, "God is my father. I've come to the realization that I'm not fatherless. I never was." Also, side note, she is the cousin of Christine Brown, who's apparently on the Sister Wives TV show, though they have never met. I do recommend this memoir. Last but certainly not least is the memoir Dad Scares Me, God Scares Me by Ervil LeBaron. In this book, pretty much all of the names are changed. Ervil is called Aiden, Joel is called Jerome, and Verlin is called Victor, from my understanding. I could be wrong, but from what I understand, these are the names of the people. Some of the names, such as the real name of her husband and mother-in-law, I do not know. Now, Ervil LeBaron was born in 1973. She was born after the drama mentioned in these earlier books, and she was 11 at the time of Ervil's death. Her father married 2 of Verlin's widows, who are called Susan and Karen. I do not know who these women actually were, though I'm pretty sure neither of them were Irene or Susan. She had an illegal marriage to a man called Samuel Saunders in the book. I suspect from the information that he is the son of either Charlotte or Lucy LeBaron, who was called Elise in this book. This woman is described as being gossipy, controlling, and nosy. Again, who it is, I'm not 100% sure. Vera was 15 years old at the time this married, and Samuel was turning 30. As the title talks about, her father was a very harsh figure in her life and did not treat the children very well. He was not like the level of abusive as the stepfather in Ruth Warner's book, but he did not treat them well. And they lived in the jungle, and like many of the people in this book were basically living in poverty throughout her childhood and in the wilderness. It was not pleasant at all. After her marriage, she has to share her husband with someone, and that first wife does not treat her very well. Eventually, though, at the age of 29, she leaves with her 3 children and starts her own business to support herself. The book starts and ends at her father's funeral in 2013, where she is able to hug Samuel and feel somewhat cathartic after everything that's happened. She, out of all of these books, actually had the most spiritual reflection, I feel like. And she ends up being kind of along the more New Age wave, but I admire the fact that she, throughout this book, while she was in and out of the cult, did a lot of personal reading and research and questioned what was going on around her before leaving. And I think that's really admirable. You know, it's easy when you're born and raised in something to just accept it, but over time, she did her own research and was like, this isn't right. It is the shortest out of all the books and has some grammar issues, but I do think it was a good read. She also showed kind of where the cult was going in the later years, as some of the cult members had followed another brother of Joel, who was named Ervil LeBaron, I believe, and he had started kind of like another extension of the cult even further south in like the jungle. And I'm not saying that like as an exaggeration. Like literally she said they had to carry a machete with them and chop down the brush, and there were giant tarantulas and snakes everywhere, and they were poor, so they had to shower in a shack. Like that's what I mean. While not the current day, we kind of see the direction that the cult was going in its later years. As far as I know, the cult Church of the Firstborn of the Fulness of Time still exists. There are people who still practice it in Mexico, in the areas of Chihuahua and Colonial LeBaron, as well as El Paso. I don't know how many members are there. It is comprised of both white Americans and Hispanics. As far as I understand from what I've read in these books, they do not have a leader at this time. They accept that their prophet has been killed, but at some time God will either send another prophet or a new revelation. But to this time, they feel like God has not done that, as far as I'm aware. Meanwhile, several people are in prison for carrying out the murders in the name of the Church of the Lamb of God. And from what I understand, I don't think anybody is still involved with it. I could be wrong, but unlike Church of the Firstborn, most of the people who were involved either no longer follow it or have gone to prison. From what I understand, some of the people who left and are free did write books about their experience, including Rena Chenoweth, who was Ervil's wife and Mark Chenoweth's sister. But some of these books are older and harder to get my hands on. If I ever do, though, I would love to talk about what those books say. So that is the story of the Church of the Fulness of Times and its rival church, Church of the Lamb of God. Joel and Ervil, the two false prophets, pitted against each other. Joel choosing a more peaceful path and unfortunately being murdered, while Ervil choosing a violent path and having a violent, sad end. Whether these men were being led by mental illness or malice or genuine desire is debatable, but either way, we can see that the end result was in both of them having a sad end. Many of these women have left these cults and come out stronger, having close families with their husbands and children, as well as joining churches that are good for them. And it should be a story of hope to any of us who are in a bad situation to know that you can leave, regardless of how you feel about it, though. I think we could all agree that it is an interesting story of the two rival cults down in Mexico. If you like this video and would like to see me talk more about cults, religions, and books, please like and subscribe and leave a comment down below. If there's a cult you'd like me to investigate or a religion you'd like me to look into, please let me know. I'm always looking for more memoirs and books to read about religion. As always, thank you for checking out my channel. Bye.